So we have to proceed with the opening speaker, Professor Andreas Petzold, which is speaking about methodology and iconography of color. Andreas Petzold, educated at Manchester University at the Cowtell Institute of Art, where he obtained a PhD on the use of color in Romanesque manuscript illumination. He was a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum from 1987 to 1999 and an associate lecturer for the Open University. He is the author of Romanesque Art. He has published extensively about color in art. Recent publications on the subject are The Iconography of Color in the Routledge Companion to Medieval Iconography, The Use of Color in Romanesque Manuscript Illumination, in Color and Light in Ancient and Medieval Art, and Color in Religion and Ritual, in the cultural history of color in the medieval age. So, Professor Petzold, you can proceed.
Thank you very much. Yes, my interest in this subject, in fact, goes back a very long time to when I was an undergraduate at Manchester University. And in my final year in 1979, I wrote a little dissertation on the use of colour in Ottonian manuscript illumination which was supervised by Professor John Alexander. So it goes back a long time, but I want to concentrate on the iconography. In this paper, I intend to look at the question of colour iconography in the medieval period. I will briefly trace its historiography and look at certain of the methodological issues which make its reconstruction a problematic one. Well, one I will argue deserving of more attention than has been the case, and one for which new opportunities have been opened up by the creation of huge digital databases of chromatic images, especially in the field of manuscript illumination. So hopefully we're moving from a black and white history of colour in the Middle Ages to a colour one. And my focus will be on manuscript illumination and on the High Middle Ages. I prefer the term colour iconography to that of symbolism, as it seems to me to be more expansive. It may be defined as a capacity of colours when found in artistic context to have meanings, interpretations, or associations attached to them. An interest in colour and its meanings can be traced back to at least the 19th century. A favourite text of mine is that of Anna Jameson's Sacred and Legendary Art, which was first published in 1848, which contains a section titled Of the Significance of Colours. In this, she provides the reader with a list of colours which she regards as appropriate to certain subjects and personages. Could I have the first slide, please? Yes, this is it's just an extract. It's just from a page from her book. But it's nevertheless, it does show a high degree of visual observation and perspicacity. But anyway, so for example, she specifies that St. John the Evangelist was usually dressed in either a red or green garment, or a combination of these two. Could we have the next slide, please? Yes, this is from the Gospels of Judith of Flanders in the Pierpont Morgan Library, and it's the opening crucifixion miniature. And you can see, it's a beautiful, it's about circa 1060, and you can see the image of crucifixion with St. John the Evangelist on the right, and he's represented in terms of his garment. He has a red mantle and a green undergarment. For example, she specifies that John the Evangelist was usually dressed in either a red or green garment, or a combination of these two. Examples of which can be seen as early as the 11th century, as in the crucifixion miniature in the Gospels of Judith of Flanders. A convention that was remarkably tenacious until the 17th century. So go to the next slide, please. So the image on the left is a painting by Domenichino, which is on loan to the National Gallery in London, and it shows St. John the Evangelist in red and green. Now, the slide on the right is from a stained glass window. It's in a church near where I live, in Bow, it's in Limehouse. It's a huge window of the crucifixion, and this is just a detail, but you can make out St. John the Evangelist there clearly in the green and the red. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that this was an extraordinary, tenacious convention. It would be interesting to examine to what extent observations of this type informed 19th century artistic practice, especially in the area of the burgeoning art of stained glass. But the notion of a fixed canon of colour iconography operating in the Middle Ages is not one that has been taken up in art historical discourse, nor does it appear to have an empirical basis behind it, and has justifiably been rejected, as is that of quasi-mystical Jungian archetypes relating to colours and meaning. So the subject of colour and its meaning in medieval art was one largely ignored in the 20th century. I'm not going to look at the reasons for that, but it's not until you get to the pioneering work of two great scholars, John Gage and Michel Pastoureau, that we get an engagement with this subject. Their work has transformed the subject and provides methodological templates, as well as raising important, though not entirely unproblematic, methodological issues. Any discussion of the subject should acknowledge their enormous contribution. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is a chapter from John Gage's book, Colour and Meaning. It was based on an article which he first published in the founding edition of Art History in 1978. But it really is a very important one, which reflects an interest in linguistics. Gage adopted an historicist approach, drawing upon pre-Newtonian concepts of colour theory, where colours are arranged on a linear scale from dark to light, as opposed to our post-Newtonian one, where colour is analysed in terms of hue, saturation, and lightness, with primacy given to hue. And what was then, he was also very influenced by the recent linguistic research on colour, especially the work of Berlin and Kay, which I'm not going to go into detail, but it is very important. The practicalities of this, in terms of my interests, are, for example, that the parameters of what is understood by purple in the early medieval period extended to dark blue, what we would describe as dark blue and dark red, with the common denominator being darkness. And this is not just restricted to language, but it's also reflected in the artistic usage of the period. And so, if I can have the next slide, these are two images. So the one on the left is from the Rabbinical Gospels. Now, I know that there's a question about the veracity of the colour images, how accurate they are in terms of reproductions. But nevertheless, I think the point is that the image from the Rabbinical Gospels with the Virgin Mary in the centre there, in the Ascension there, it's almost bordering on a dark blue, but I think it's intended to be would have been red as a purple at the time. And the one on the right is just a page I took at random from Percope's Book of Henry II, an early 11th century manuscript in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, and it's a sort of plum red. But what I'm trying to say, what was understood by purple, was much broader than what we would define as purple. And so this obviously presents problems and difficulties if you're trying to reconstruct an iconography of colour. And Gage rejected the idea of an iconography of colour based on hue in the early Middle Ages. Now, I have some problems about this, but how colours were classified and their terminology must have determined medieval colour concepts and categories. But were they thinking in terms, or were they based on materials, abstract colour terms, or terms which had concrete reference? And I also think the use of these terms would in any case be far less standardised than today. We live in a world of standardisation, but I mean this was not the case in the Middle Ages, and would have been far less abstracted than our own sort of terminology. And it may be that Gage, his article is a very important one, but it may be that Gage went too far in his formulations required to be worked out in greater detail and correlated more closely with art, material culture. Heather Pullian, whose work I admire very much, has, for example, commented that while hue is less important in a number of medieval cultures, it is neither unimportant nor non-existent. There is also evidence that as we enter into the late Middle Ages, the development of a vernacular, so I don't think you can think of it in terms of the Middle Ages as being as a heterogeneous. You're looking at 1,000 years, and you're looking in terms of linguistic developments. You're looking, it's a diachronic situation. There's also evidence that as we enter into the later Middle Ages, with the development of vernacular languages, a more hue-based conception of colour emerges. And the ramifications of this for medieval colour iconography need to be considered and analysed. One linguist, and this is from this cultural history of colour, to which I contributed a chapter, but there's a very good chapter on language. One linguist has recently noted that in the late Middle Ages, a new sensibility to hues emerged, with a tendency to separate hue terms from brightness terms. And this would appear to be reflected in a greater standardisation of colour iconography in the later Middle Ages. My own research, and that of Patricia Sternemann, on the subject of colour notes, appears to support a more nuanced view than that of John Gage, and suggests that by the 12th century at least, colours were increasingly identified by their abstract colour name rather than by their pigment or interior one. So could I have the next slide, please? So these are some of these colour notes typically consist of an initial or abbreviation written in red in lead point and placed in the margin adjacent to a coloured initial. So this is from a manuscript. It's in Hereford Cathedral Library, and you can make out on the far left, these are the guide letters, so there's an N next to an N, but you can also make out these colour notes. So there's an A there next to the blue, which I'm presuming refers to azure, and then there's an R next to the P there, which could refer, because in England in the 12th century you have a trilingual situation, so it could refer to the Latin terms rubeus, it could refer possibly to French rouge, or it could refer to red, English red, R-E-A-D. But anyway, but it seems, but an R, for example, adjacent to a red initial may refer to either the Latin term rubeus, the French rouge, or perhaps the English red, reflecting the trilingualism prevalent in 12th century England, but not as one might expect to the pigment terms used in its paintings, such as medium, red lead, or vermicion or cenobium, the terms used for vermilion. Could I have the next slide, please? I've got a couple more examples. This is an A. It's a manuscript that was made at Rivaux, a Cistercian manuscript, circa 1170. And you can just, hopefully you can make out, there's an R there on the right, which is adjacent to this red initial. I hope you can make that out. But in fact, there are quite a few of these. The Cistercians seem to be quite keen on their colour notes and in this sense of standardization and codification. And the next one is not mine. It's not one that I've noted, but it was noted by Patricia Sternemann in her article. And you can just about make out, with those little hillocks there, you can just about make out a V next to the green, and there's an R next to the red. Well, I hope you can make it out. And there's an A next to the blue there. But you can just about make out these sort of coloured initials, these colour notes which are underneath the paint surface. Okay. Gage's ideas have been very influential, most notably on the work of Byzantinist Liz James. In her book, which was based upon her PhD thesis that she did at the Courtauld, who was dismissive of the notion of a colour symbol or iconography in Byzantine art based on hue, and also emphasises differences with Western practice, with Eastern more fluid, though both unfixed. Now, the problem I have with this, I accept her point, but I think it tends to result in her closing down any discussion of colour iconography in Byzantine art, which evidence is provided both in textual sources of the period, and you can see this in some of the earlier German bibliography which on this subject, as well as the pictorial ones. To cite one conspicuous example, could I have the next slide, please? And this is from the Gregorian Nazianzus manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And you can see Christ there is in purple. And in fact, in this manuscript, Christ and the Virgin Mary are consistently represented in purple. And this example is particularly interesting because it was a manuscript that was commissioned by the Emperor, Basil I, there may be a link between, it may reinforce a link between sacred and temporal power. Right, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so that's John Gage. Now, in contrast, Michel Pastoureau, who's written a huge amount on colour, approaches one very different, or one anchored in anthropology and social and cultural history rather than art history. He's published extensively on the subject of colour in the Middle Ages, but is best known to an English-speaking audience through a series of semi-popular books which have taken as their subject a single colour, beginning with a volume on blue, which may be taken as representative and from our standpoint is one of the most interesting, as he isolates a paradigm shift in the status of blue in the 12th and 13th century, the so-called Blue Revolution. This is reflected, and according to him, perhaps pioneered in developments in the dyeing industry, though this may be a chicken and egg situation. I think it probably is. I think that the paradigm shift preceded its manifestation in the material culture and the textiles of the period. Yes, so in developments in dyeing, though this may be a chicken and egg situation which enabled the production of a deeper, more saturated blue to be produced from woad, with garments dyed in a saturated blue becoming the fashion amongst the elite, supplanting the more traditional red and purple. And you can see this next slide, please. So these are two manuscripts which are roughly contemporary. The slide on the left is from the Fécamp Psalter. It's about circa 1170. Anyway, it's the last third of the 12th century. And it represents a donor portrait, and it has been suggested that this may represent Helena of Aquitaine, but no, not all specialists accept it. But the slide on the right is a roughly contemporary manuscript. It's called the Helmershouden Psalter, which is in the Walter Sark Gallery in Baltimore, and it possibly represents a member of Henry the Lion's, either his wife or one of his, possibly his daughter Gisela. But you can see one is in this saturated blue, and the other is in the more traditional red, which would have been used for as the most expensive dye. It's dressed in the more traditional saturated red for the lead. Now, as a trajectory, I find Pastoureau's thesis regarding the change in the status of blue convincing, though I think it is one that requires to be worked out in greater detail, and it has a distinct Francophile bias to it. Now, it's one that his book has attracted quite a degree of criticism. So Heather Pulliam, for example, has taken issue with his downplaying of the use of blue in insular manuscript illumination, the use of which can be seen, for example, for the garment. So could I have the next slide? So if we're looking at these, I'm sorry, the one on the left is not a very good slide from the Book of Kells, but you can see it does show Christ enthroned, and his tunic is in blue. And the one on the right is from the Codex Ignorius in Stockholm, and you can see St. Matthew in his mantle is in blue. I think that there was an interest certainly in blue, but in insular manuscript illumination and amongst writers such as Bede and so on. So what I'd like to now focus on is more recent trends in medieval studies that are relevant to this discussion of colour symbolism. One of these is an interest in the iconology of materials and its related textual sources, most importantly, certain passages in the Bible, and the theological and exegetical commentary which they generated. A key figure in this trend is that of Herbert Kessler, who regards the medieval conception of colour symbol as one that has its primary textual basis in the Bible and its exegesis, as well as the genre of lapidaries, an important text of the period concerned with precious stones and their interpretation, and one that is also derived to a large extent from associations with precious stones. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, I'm not going to talk about lapidaries, but they are an important source for elucidating colour iconography, colour symbolism. And this is a page from a lapidary which is attached to the Aberdeen Vestry, which has been digitised. It's a late 12th century English manuscript, and it has a vestry, and then it has this lapidary attached to it. And this is quite interesting because this manuscript does actually have colour notes in it, which are described in the excellent website that accompanies the digitisation of this manuscript. Now, he comments that colour acquired, this is Kessler, because it acquired symbolic meaning associated with natural qualities and references in scriptures and lapidaries. Suger, Hildegard of Bingen, and other commentators attest to its significance. And I will briefly at the end look at Hildegard of Bingen, an image from Hildegard of Bingen's Scivias. Can we have the next slide, please? This is an example of how this approach can be applied, which has been discussed by Paul Binsky, can be seen in the use of materials in the Trinity Chapel at Canterbury Cathedral, built in the late 12th century to house the shrine of Thomas Becket, with its alternating red and white columns. Could I have the next one, because it doesn't show, but you can see these columns are, but they're pinkish and white. These columns are respectively made of white limestone and highly polished pink marble, a colour scheme also taken up on the tiles of the floor as well as the walls, which were originally painted blood red. The pink marble was brought from Belgium and is unprecedented in its use in English architecture, suggesting that much thought went behind its use. This binary colour scheme of white and red has echoes in the Bible. One of the Song of Songs, the Beloved, taken to be Christ's countenance, is described as candidus et rubicundus. It can be interpreted with the traditional trope of virginity and martyrdom, or more viscerally, as a reminder of the spinning of Becket's white brains and red blood, which is dwelled on in earlier accounts of Becket's martyrdom. A chain of associations which may have been intended to be evoked in the mind of the pilgrim when visiting the site. So could I have the next slide? So the next I'm going to take from a manuscript which is one of my favourites, which is the St. Alban's Psalter. And this is the miniature of Mary Magdalene announcing the Christ's resurrection to the apostles, which is very rare. Now, you can see in this that all the apostles are represented with these very distinctive light blue tunics. And this, another example of how this approach can be applied, which has been discussed by Harry Stirrup, can be seen in the use of blue tunics for sacred figures in the St. Alban's Psalter, in contrast to the secular ones, to the secular figures who are not represented. So these are just restricted to the sacred male figures. Well, also the Virgin Mary, actually. Stirrup references Scripture and its interpretation to explicate this artistic practice. He observes that relevant primary exegetical sources would have been circulated and consulted within monastic communities, forming part of the Lectio Divina, and could potentially have informed their artistic practice. The monastic library at St. Albans, for example, was populated in the Anglo-Norman period with key patristic, encyclopedic, and exegetical texts, including such texts as Bede's De Tabernacle on the Tabernacle, which has a lot of references to colour symbolism, and Rabanus Maurus's Encyclopedia. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is actually a copy of Rabanus Maurus's On the Universe, which was copied at St. Albans in the mid-12th century. And it's quite interesting from our standpoint, my standpoint, because you can actually see in the far margin there's this little V next to the green initial, a reference to presumably Viride, or it could be Vert. So it does have these. It's not only has a lot of colour symbolism in Rabanus Maurus's text, but it also has these colour notes, which I'm very interested in. The monastic, in discussing the light blue tunics worn by sacred figures in the prefatory miniatures in the St. Albans Psalter, Stirrup has made a connection with certain passages in the book of Exodus, where the term hyacinthinus, light blue, but occasionally translated as violet, literally the colour of hyacinths, is used, both as one of the four colours used to describe the curtains of the tabernacle, and also in describing the garment of the high priest. Could I have the next slide? This is from the cloisters in New York, and I think it's clear here that the term hyacinthinus does refer to blue, because this is people have. This is an area of discussion. One of the earliest illustrations of the curtains in the tabernacle in the early 14th century manuscript, the colour which is used to denote hyacinthinus, is clearly blue, leaving no ambiguity as to what is meant by the term by this date at least. The garment of the high priest is described in the book of Exodus as a tunicum totum hyacinthinum, an entirely blue tunic. In turn, this term was invested with symbolic significance in exegetical and monastic writings to signify the heavenly, tradition summed up by Joseph Victor in the early 12th century when he stated that hyacinthinus signifies the hope of heaven because it demonstrates the colour of heaven and of pure sky. Though Stirrup's explanation is convincing, it is doubtful that the light blue tunics were an innovation of the Alexis master, the name given to the artist of the miniature in the St. Albans Psalter, as he suggests, as they are found in earlier painting, especially in manuscripts made at the monastery of Reichenau on Lake Constance. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is my comparison between the miniature and the St. Albans Psalter, are one taken from the Pericopes book of Henry II. And you can see both Christ and the apostles there represented with these light blue tunics. And this is a leitmotif of this particular, of the Lyotard school of Reichenau illumination. And what I suspect, as I found, especially in manuscripts made at the monastery of Reichenau on Lake Constance, such as the Pericopes book of Henry II, made in the early 11th century, the colour schema which appears to have close parallels to that in the St. Albans Psalter, which I discussed in my thesis, suggesting a similar model may have been known to the Alexis master. I doubt whether he had, but a similar model. Another trend that has been an increased interest in liturgy, especially in its visual and sensory aspects, in which colour played a role. A seminal article, I have the next slide please, in this regard is that of Jean-Claude Bon on the Limoges Sacramentary, made at the beginning of the 12th century, intended for use in the celebration of the Mass at Limoges Cathedral. This manuscript would have been carried in solemn procession, placed directly on the altar, surrounded by flickering candles and lamps, and the scent and smoke of incense, blessed and kissed notably on the image of the crucifixion by the celebrant of the Mass. The predominance of saturated red in the colour scheme of the cycle of miniatures in the manuscript, especially in the mantles of Christ and the Virgin Mary, would have been especially relevant to the theme of the Eucharist, and set against the saturated blue backgrounds which may have picked up on the stained glass. So could I have the next slide? The only miniature which has as its subject an episode from the life of a saint is one representing appropriately the stoning of the titular saint, St. Stephen. So the cathedral is dedicated to St. Stephen, who wears a red dalmatic. And what appears to be mitre, and holds out red, bloodied hands, appropriate for his martyrdom, and the liturgical colour for martyrs according to the Roman rite. Bon proposes that viewing the striking colours of the manuscript facilitated access to the invisible God, the main material luminosity of the colours serving as a ritual complementing the liturgy. Now, the last trend I wish to comment on is that of an interest in the representation of skin colour, especially in relation to issues to do with racial identity. Could I have the next slide, please? So the seminal article really on this subject is that by Dorothy de Kirk, which discusses depictions of black people in the Ashburn and Pentateuch, a late antique manuscript produced in the 6th century. In this, she contrasts the antique discourse in which black skin was equated with the exotic to that which emerged in the early medieval period, where black skin became a metonym for evil, a characterization which increasingly comes to the fore in the portrayal of black figures in the Ashburn and Pentateuch. I think a larger study of skin colour going back to the antique period and in the the Middle Ages in general is a desideratum, is something. Okay, so I'd like to fast forward now. Next slide, please, to a period. So this is from Ashburn and Pointsnake. Next slide, please. From the period I know more about, and this is from the Buried Bible, and it's circa 1135. From the 12th century from the 12th century, facial types are increasingly differentiated in art, with greater facial modelling and colour differentiation, as can be seen, for example, in an illustration in the Buried Bible, in which a black man is depicted in this case in a positive light. The representation of faces as black need not necessarily, however, be a signifier of black people. And Lindsay Kaplan, in her recent book, has, for example, analysed the depictions of dark-skinned figures in the Christological scenes in a group of related early 13th century English Psalters, whom she identifies as intended to represent Jewish rather than black people, and whose portrayal may be related to rising anti-Semitism in England at the time. Go to the next slide, please. Yeah, I'm going to discuss this, but she doesn't actually discuss this. She concludes that what I say is relevant to this. What she says is relevant. She concludes that the images embody the Jew's spiritual abjection by representing as dark and infernal, not hellish, but inferior. This portrayal of Christ's persecutors draws upon traditional associations of blackness with sin, evil, and the demonic, and Kaplan argues also with death, illness, injury, and damnation. An example not discussed by Kaplan, but germane to her argument, is that of the portrayal scene in the Christological cycle in the mid-13th century Missal of Henry of Chichester, where Christ's prosecutors, including Malpas, are represented with dark features and have stereotypical Jewish semantic markers, such as the hooked nose. Though interestingly, Judas is represented with the same complexion as Christ, white and pinkish models, but the characteristic red hair without a halo. So this is a manuscript which is in the John Library's library in Manchester, and it is a missal, but it was intended for the private use of its patron, who is actually represented in one of the miniatures. These are 5 miniatures in front of the canon of the Mass, and this one is the one representing the betrayal, and it's one of my favourites, but the manuscript is anyway. In terms of the taxonomy of skin colour, 3 colours can be isolated in these cycle miniatures. The mixed white and pink of Christ and the male sacred figures, possibly a reference to the description of the complexion of the beloved as being rubicundus et candidus in the Song of Songs. The dark skins of Christ's persecutors, which you can see here. So you can see that guy holding the lantern has this distinctive nose, the elongated nose, as a caricature of Jewish people. The dark skins of Christ's persecutors. Go to the next one. And the pure white. So pure white, the Virgin Mary, and there are 2 other female figures, one which I haven't, but there's the actual midwife in the Nativity, an unusual feature, who has pure white face, and there's also another female figure, but you can see the Virgin Mary is represented consistently in this pure white, presumably a reference to her purity. What would seem to be a signifier of purity. Judas, as we've looked, Judas is, you can see there's Judas there, and one of his garments is white, his undergarment, which is actually a very unusual garment colour, particularly in manuscript illumination. And it's partly because obviously the support manuscripts is white, and frequently that can have symbolic significance. Certainly Herbert Kessler has suggested this. But anyway, let's get back to Jews. Represented in a white armour garment or tunic, an unusual garment colour, though not without precedent in this context, as it can be found in the betrayal scene in one of the early 13th century English Psalters, which Lindsay Kaplan identifies as one of the first in English illumination to represent dark-skinned persecutors. Go over the next slide. So this is from she discusses two psalters, the early 13th century psalters, which were made at Oxford, and they have extensive Christological cycles. And this one is the betrayal scene, and you can see it's one of the first to have these figures that are actually have these very dark faces, and they're clearly they're clearly nefarious in their nature. But interesting, as I say, your Judas here, certainly one of his garments is white. And what she suggests, which I agree with, but which Lindsay suggests one of you, which makes one wonder, and I wonder whether the Sarah Master, which is the name being given to the artist of the Missal of Henry Chichester, the name given to the, had seen it. Cameron suggests that the white might reflect his repentance and refusal to participate in the crucifixion. So the next one, the final image I wish to discuss is from a manuscript that we don't know where it is now. It either was destroyed in the war, or it we don't know what's happened to it. It's somewhere. Now it's from Hildegard of Bingen, who's one of the most interesting figures in the 12th century, and though a facsimile of the manuscript was made before it was destroyed. So the final wish to discuss, where colour is intended to generate meaning rather than reflect reality, is Hildegard of Bingen the Scivias, where there is an unusual representation on the theme of baptism. In this, the would-be converts are represented as black children, so you can see them on the left, and as represented as black children. An equation is made between blackness and sin, and enter the womb of a female figure who is entirely gold and may be identified as Ecclesia, the church. Her womb is perforated like a fishing net. They re-emerge from her mouth clothed, according to the text, in pure white garments. Though in fact, they're represented as gold figures, so they come out of her mouth there. The Latin is candidus, which is a term. There are two terms in Latin for white, candidus and albus, and candidus basically is gleaming white. It's like it's as opposed to sort of matte white. Of initiation, having lost their dark skin, they are represented in the image as entirely gold, unlike the figure of Ecclesia. So to sort of sum up, really, I hope that I've demonstrated the question of colour in its iconography as one deserving attention, but one that requires caution. And certain guidelines need to be taken into account. First, the medieval conception of colour was a very different one from our own. It would not have been as abstracted, but one more closely linked to nature and concrete reference in the outside world. Nor, and this appears to be the case to a great extent in the early Middle Ages at least, is the conception one primarily based on hue, is in our own post-Newtonian one, but one dependent more on the dimension of lightness and darkness, as well as the association attached to materials. There appears to be a greater progression in the later Middle Ages, at least in linguistics, to hue-based conception, which is reflected in art. Secondly, the study of colour, iconography needs to be diachronic, related to specific contexts, both physical, geographic, and cultural. To quote Maya Shapiro, he said, there is not exclusively one symbolic meaning attached to colour. For in every concrete situation, the colour or colours are not only outer surfaces, but also expressions of the situation as itself. And I think, as can be seen in the examples discussed in this paper, so context is absolutely crucial. You cannot think in terms of an abstracted sort of iconography of colour. Thirdly, linguistic classification of colours must have played a role. Finally, the study of colour needs to be an interdisciplinary one, drawing upon a wide range of subject specialisms, most importantly linguistics, semiotics, theology, anthropology, material culture, the history of dress and social history. So which all makes it quite a difficult enterprise, but one I think that is deserving of more attention, and I'm sure will, and one that I think can exploit these chromatic databases that have been created, particularly in the field of manuscript illumination. So hopefully we're moving away, we're looking at colour as a potential, as having potential meaning, as a potential signifier from a sort of black and white history of medieval art, which was the case certainly when I started as an undergraduate many years ago. People would discuss these beautiful manuscripts and beautiful medieval art as if it was a black and white photograph, which was the main medium really for documenting art. Okay, thank you very much. Are there going to be any questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Petzold. Now it's a question of the questions and criticals from the public. There is a microphone circulating in the room, so please proceed. Is there any question?
I'm sure there must be some. I don't mind you disagreeing with me.
Yeah. For the breaking the silence, I have one question for you,
Yes,
Mr. Petzold. Is there any universal meaning or symbolism for each particular color in the Middle Ages?
No, I don't think there is. I think I would reject that concept. I think you need to think in terms of, I think there are iconographic usages of colour, which one needs to be cautious, but I don't think you can think in those, in sort of 19th century terms of a canon of colour iconography. No, I don't, and that has been rejected by our art historians, and I think justifiably. But I think they've rather thrown out the baby with the water. I think that doesn't mean that colour wasn't used. And I'm sure it was, because we look at colour very much in terms of, well, we have been looking at colour in very much, we have been looking at medieval art in very much in terms as if it's a black and white photograph. And we haven't been asking these questions, and it seems to be often the artist they are intended. But it's not easy, and you have to look at it, and I think in terms of the textual sources of the period. Nobody have got any other questions?
Yes. So there is no any Christian tradition, any Christian culture that is that is, for example, stronger than the individual or geographical background of the artist?
Yes. I mean, I think these are important factors. Yes. But you're talking in terms of the reception of images. That people must have been able to interpret these. And I think one shouldn't think in terms of medieval art as being the product. You should think in terms of more postmodernist terms, medieval art being the sole product of the artist. It was very much, there were other agents at stake, particularly in the early Middle Ages, if you're looking at things like monasteries. I think these, the artists would have discuss things presumably in a factory or something like that, but they do seem to reflect ideas that were prevalent at the time, and they seem to be very much a product of multiple agents. So yes, I think that we've got to be careful about viewing medieval art through the lens of through Renaissance lens. We need to look at it from the standpoint of medieval people. And I think also whether we should see these images necessarily as art, possibly they were intended as forms of aids to devotion, that they had, so the idea that we look at them purely as, say, aesthetic is one that's, I don't think is very useful.
And what about circulation of these religious objects like codex, missals, and so on, psalters, and so on? For example, produced in a particular background, geographical background, with this particular color, typical of this region, and so on. But, well, traveling for another country, another community, another monastery, etc., no? The reception of this object, no? For example, this miniature and so on, is the same in the, well, the center of reception than in the center of production of this object?
Right. You mean in terms of, say, semantics, some things like Byzantine art, which obviously is a major influence on the West.
Yeah.
But yet they didn't clearly, it comes from a different sort of intellectual matrix, doesn't it? I mean, obviously the very few people in the Latin West knew Greek, and so you're looking at, so how did they interpret these? And I think they often, yeah. So I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is representing the Virgin Mary in blue, for example, which we see as standard in Western art. Though in fact, it's rather more complicated that if you actually look at examples, it really becomes in the 14th, 15th century that it becomes standard. But in fact, it is preceded in Byzantine art. And Michel Pastore doesn't consider that at all. Yes. Okay, this gentleman has something to ask. We'd like to ask a question.
Thank you for that fascinating overview.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned in passing purpurea. Was it always associated with royalty, or was there a wider variety of meanings for the term?
Sorry?
Was it always associated strictly with royalty, the purple, or was it a broader sense?
No, I think the meaning of purple, because I was talking about purple being diachronic, it actually changes. So the Carolingian period, it begins to be associated particularly with Christ and the Christ's martyrdom and the Christ's blood. And in fact, the blood often purple is linked in the writings of the period with blood. But that only emerges in the royalty, the imperial aspect goes back to obviously goes back to antiquity and is inherited within the Byzantine culture. And you can see it reflected in Western art, for example, particularly in those Etonian German manuscripts of the 11th century. But the meaning of a new meaning for purple emerges in the Carolingian period, when it does begin to be associated particularly with Christ's martyrdom and his passion. And there are, I think Herbert Kessel is the first person, but there are texts, I think, that support this particular view. So it's not static. I haven't, but the whole, you need to look at, in studying, I think, this subject, you need to both look at the textual sources and the visual imagery, and they tend to have been looked at, they tend to be seen in separate compartments, and see how they interact with one another. So I hope, and the interesting thing is that purple, this is partly Pasteur's, the purple it is the prestige colour in the early Middle Ages, and it ceases to be so in the 12th century, when this royal blue, this saturated blue seems to become this valorized colour. And of course, there's material factors like as the use of the ultramarine, but why that happens. And the other interesting about purple is that actually, there's been a huge amount of work, obviously, on pigment identification. But we now know in manuscripts that purple was actually produced from a relatively cheap material. It's ochre, which was, though it wasn't in terms of textiles, this isn't the case, isn't it? The Turanian purple, which was incredibly expensive. But certainly the parchment dyed was from this ochre material, which is relatively cheap. So it's not, you can't draw an equation there between the value of the materials and the value attached to the colour. Okay. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes. So following up on the topic of purple, what about the distinction between purple and violet?
That's a very good question, because I don't know when violet as a colour term first emerges. But that is a good question. So the Latin, and the purpureus, as I said, is quite a broad spectrum. Certainly violet it's a term used by Newson, isn't it? I'm just wondering, and it is a term that you find in, if you're looking at liturgical colours, but when it's first, it's an interesting question, and it's one that really requires more research. As I think, so the whole thing, there needs to be a synchronization, and hopefully this is part of the attention of objective of this conference, between different faculties, so linguistics, art, material culture, and textual, the study of textual sources. This is one of the slight problems I have with Michel Pastoureau, because he says that blue is never mentioned in the Bible, but it is. So I'm not entirely sure why I think he's thinking in terms of it being of an abstract colour rather than there are terms for blue. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. I just wanted to remark on something that you said, that is this pre-modern focus on brightness rather than hue.
Yes.
And of course, there is a philosophical explanation for that, because for Aristotle, whose theory of color was, of course, dominant, was the idea that material objects are actualized, their potential to be transparent or their transparency is actualized by light.
Yes.
So that any material object is more or less transparent or has its transparency actualized. And therefore you go from a scale of more transparent, so white, to less transparent, black. Yeah. And that's why you have this focus on brightness rather than a focus on hue, because it emphasizes this aspect of the transparent that is part of the nature of the object to be sort of actualized. So there is really no space there for hue from this point of view. Of course, there is an alternative theory of color, but that's the way I understood it.
I agree with that. The problem I have there is, would artists have been aware of this sort of Aristotelian colour theory? I mean, this whole thing, to what extent colour theory, to what extent would an artist have had knowledge of it? And how is that reflected in pictorial art?
That's a good question, but I suppose that some of them might have access to theories of perspective, for instance, from Alhazen and others.
We certainly know. I mean, there is some very interesting research going on, isn't there, in the 13th century, where we know that they were studying Aristotle. We know that they were studying colour, and people have been correlating that with art. And this is relatively recent, and it is very interesting work being done, and particularly with the Franciscans and some of these people of that time. And you also do get, in some of the technical treatises, you do get some sort of knowledge of some of the colour theory. But I mean, again, the problem with a lot of these textual sources is that they seem to be copying exercises. They just copied these things. And to what extent they reflect the ideas of the time can be quite difficult. But what you're saying is totally correct. But it makes this whole question more problematic and more difficult. And it means that, but I think the problem is, people have just tended to say, no, there isn't any sort of colour iconography, which I don't think is the case. And I think it's important to continue interrogating these questions and continue asking them. The more sophisticated models will increasingly develop. Thank you. Any more questions?
Yes.
Oh.
One more question.
One more question. Who is the questioner? Oh, yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I had a quick question about if you think iconographic color trends would transpose to material culture. Say, like the Lichfield Angel, you talked about architecture and how there was pink and white trends in the Canterbury Church.
I think that there is a whole iconography of color in ecclesiastical architecture, and as increasingly we have an idea of what these churches originally looked like, I think it was important. Really, a seminal article is that by Barbara Daimling on these red doors, where she talks about in front of these red doors, actual court cases would have taken place, and so that they, in fact, and that's the actual colour of doors would have been important. I think that there's a lot of scope for increasing research on this, particularly, as I say, as we get to know what the original colours were. And I think other areas that would be interesting to look at would be screens and the objects within the church which had particular importance. So I do, in that chapter I've written on the cultural history, I do briefly look at rood screens in the 15th century and the colour scheme there. But I think there's a lot on more scope. And of course also this thing about portable objects like just particularly crucifixes and the portable objects that were used in the liturgy. And this is going back to that article by Bon. This was not a manuscript that would have been stuck in the library. This was a manuscript that was used in the liturgy and would have been picked up in the architecture, and of course most importantly on the vestments worn by the priests and the celebrants of the Mass and the liturgy and the ecclesiastical figures in general. So yes, I think that there's a lot more work to be done on that, and I suspect over the next 10, 20 years that there will be. I think one of the speakers is talking about this sort of type of thing. Right, okay.
One more question. Is there any substantial difference in chromatism between Western European countries and the Byzantine Empire, taking into account the trade of the materials for fabricating colors?
Well, certainly. Byzantine, if you look at Theophilus' Data versus Artibus in his Preface, he looks at various countries that were particularly associated with particular mediums, and he isolates but the Greek Byzantium as being excelling in their colours and their use of colours, and that's partly what he's hoping his treatise will tell people about. Now, obviously this whole thing about you're right, trade routes are very, very important, and I wasn't really talking about pigments, but there has been a lot of type of work on this, but trade routes are very, very important. And there are periods when you will find, for example, that they don't have access to ultramarine, and they have to use substitutes, which is they tend to use azurite. But in the 13th century, I think for some reason they didn't. They have quite a long period. They didn't have access to Pacific trade routes, so they were broken up. That's an interesting question. Yes.
Thank you very much. Is there any question? Any more questions? So, Professor Petzold, I appreciate your brilliant talk and thank you very much indeed.